so much for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Nancy Butcher, and I'm the co-director of Impact. We are really pleased to bring you today's webinar in conjunction with our friends and our colleagues from CanStat, which is the Canadian Network for Statistical Training and Trials. If you'd like to learn more about CanStat and their training opportunities, you can click the link that's going to be placed in the chat. Today, we have Dr. Natalie Rosen with us from the Departments of Psychology and Neuroscience and Obstetrics and Gynecology from Dalhousie University in Halifax. She's going to speak about gender and sex in research and clinical trials. So Dr. Rosen is going to present for about 45 minutes, and then we will have an open Q&A until about the top of the hour. And this is going to be followed by a closed discussion period between Dr. Rosen and the Impact Fellows, the Trials Enrichment Group, and the CanStat Fellows. So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks, Natalie.
Okay. Hi, you can hear me okay in the sorry, I lost the visual for a second, but I think I've got it back. It looks okay? Awesome. Okay. Thanks for inviting me to be here. I'm happy to be here talking about this topic that I feel quite passionately about, and I hope we're going to have some, interesting discussion together. So we're going to talk about best practices and guidelines for researchers to build more equitable, reflective, and inclusive research in clinical trials with respect to gender and sex. My objective today is really to sort of start to stimulate some critical thought about the effective integration of sex and gender in these contexts, and to offer some recommendations and resources for continued learning, because there's a lot to learn in this area and I can't get through all of it. So that's sort of the expectation. I'm joining you today from Nova Scotia, so from Dalhousie University, which is located on Mi'kma'ki land. And I just wanted to briefly mention that in Mi'kma'ki, there were two treaties. They were called the Peace and Friendship Treaties that were signed in the 1700s between the Mi'kmaq Nation and the British Crown. And importantly, this agreement did not include ceding their land. So this means that where I'm talking to you from today is still the land that I'm living on and working on is still owned by the Mi'kmaq people. The other important piece about these treaties is that they were really about the relationships between people, and they explicitly state that Indigenous peoples were to have the right to control their day-to-day lives. In Nova Scotia, we also have the oldest and most established African Canadian communities. They've been here for over 400 years, and I just wanted to also recognize their histories, contributions, and legacies for where I'm speaking from today. So here's the topics that I'm briefly going to touch on. So we're going to talk about eligibility, recruitment, sampling plans and data analyses, measurement of genders and sexes, which I think is a key topic, measurement over time, working with the existing or old data, working with validated measures, and a little bit around applying for funding. So I'm going to try, as I mentioned, provide some questions for your consideration to help guide your decisions. And I'm also going to try and provide some practical advice around these topics. Some of them I'll go into more depth, and some of them it might just be a slide or two to sort of pique your interest and get you thinking about, questions you need to ask. A lot of what I'm covering today comes from a set of excellent resources that were funded by the CIHR and have been released since 2022. So there are 8 toolkits that map onto those topics that I just talked about so far. The toolkits are freely available for download online. I think Chelsea's going to put in the chat the web link that I have on the slide. And these were developed to address the erasure and research of people who've been marginalized and minoritized based on their genders, their sexes, and their sexualities and identities, including intersex, trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people, among others. I also want to acknowledge the authors, because obviously, they were really influential in the work that I'm sharing with you today. So let's get started then. Key step in research is deciding who can and can't participate based on some set of shared characteristics. In other words, your eligibility criteria. I'm going to highlight 3 overarching considerations. The first is around precision. So this is like which variables are ultimately key to your study. Clear communication. You want to communicate eligibility in a way that's understandable and makes sense for both the people with minoritized gender, sexes, sexualities, as well as majoritized individuals. And you want to ensure that your eligibility criteria doesn't inadvertently exclude prospective participants who have typically been ignored or marginalized. Just to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page with respect to some of the key variables in terms of gender, sex, and sexuality, I'm just going to briefly go over these quick definitions for you. So gender identity, this is your personal sense of your own gender. So women, men, non-binary people, agender people. Expression is a person's behavior and expression that is associated with your gender, masculinity, femininity, androgyny. A sexed or gendered experience is an experience that is associated with a particular sex or gender, such as pregnancy, prostate cancer, uterine prolapse. A gendered social role is a social role that can include a range of behaviors and attitudes that are considered appropriate based on a person's sex, typically. So parenting, like a mother-father figure or husband-wife sort of partnership. And then the last one is sexual identity, orientation, or behavior. So who one is sexually or romantically attracted to, or who one engages in sexual behavior with. So gay, aromantic, women who have sex with women, men who have sex with men are all examples. So the key question to ask yourself when you're thinking about eligibility is, what is the most appropriate shared characteristic among my participants? Am I limiting my eligibility criteria to gender identity, like I'm asking about for women, even though I'm interested in an experience such as pregnancy? Am I conflating social role, like being a mother, with gender identity, such as being a woman? So remembering that people who identify with social roles, like mother or father, they can also have diverse gender identities. So you can have fathers who have gestated and birthed their children, for example. Am I using gender or sexual identity, boy, men, as a proxy for body parts when I'm actually interested in something that happens with a penis? And who might be excluded if this key feature is used to determine inclusion criteria, and sort of like, is this a reasonable exclusion? So let me look at an example to start with. So let's say we have a researcher who is interested in women's experiences of pregnancy while they are incarcerated in prison. So they originally think that their eligibility criteria is that they need to recruit women. However, upon reflecting further, they might realize that actually what they're interested in is not the gender of the participants, but rather the experience of pregnancy while being in prison, in a women's prison. So the revised eligibility criteria is actually anyone who's experienced pregnancy while incarcerated in a women's prison. So this can include cis, trans, non-binary, and anyone else who's had this experience, right? And importantly, here we're avoiding the conflation of that gender identity with a gendered experience that I outlined in those definitions. Another consideration is around, the possibilities of inadvertent marginalization. So when we choose to exclude individuals, groups, or communities or populations from your research, it always requires a careful justification. So, and that justification is important so that you're like giving some thought to whether you're marginalizing someone unintentionally or a group unintentionally. So, for example, if your research is focused on motherhood, it may be unjustifiable. You might not have like sort of a logical reason to include only women, given that other people can also identify as mothers. I want to talk for a minute about language. So in health research, so these definitions and some of these thoughts come from another excellent resource, which is linked at the bottom there, called Beyond the Binary, that was developed through the Women's Health Research Institute in BC. So it's a BC guide, and you can read the whole guide online. And we've actually received additional funding to scale this out across Canada. So stay tuned for that, but specifically around language. And in health research, there's sort of three main approaches right now to gendered language, and each has some sort of implications and limitations to consider. The first is a gender additive approach. So for example, saying women and gender diverse people who are pregnant. And this approach intentionally sort of retains naming women within it to acknowledge really sort of the years of advocacy that women have gone through to recognize that they have unique developmental processes and physiological processes that need to be included in research, especially given that women are still underrepresented in clinical trials. So that's the reasoning and the thinking behind an additive approach. The other two approaches, so gender neutral would be like, so not using any gender, so pregnant people, and anatomy based would be focused on the body part, so people who have a uterus or people who are capable of pregnancy. These approaches have a bit of a mixed reaction. So some trans and other health organizations support these approaches, but others don't like it as much. A couple of the critiques around those approaches is that focusing on body parts can be experienced as dehumanizing for some people, or erasing, some of their particular experiences. Another key critique is that it can be a bit more confusing or difficult for people who are not as fluent in English to understand. So those are a couple of the considerations. I can tell you, like in my own research over the last few years, we've sort of had an evolution of trying out a few of these different terms, and it just sort of reflects the fact that this is an evolving sort of area, and there's a lot of changes, and we have to kind of roll with it and see what fits best and what makes sense as we sort of continue to learn more. So I'm going to show you an example from a study I did with a graduate student on pregnancy loss of couples. Couples where one person recently had a pregnancy loss. So we've described the sample in one study using sort of the gender neutral approach. We found that gestational individuals and their partners, or the partners of gestational individuals. And then in a more recent, as we sort of learned and read more about the additive approach, we also, this is from a methods of a different study, same sample still though, that talked about women and gender diverse individuals who are pregnant when a loss occurred, and their men, women, and gender diverse partners who are not pregnant. So one of the considerations is that it's quite a mouthful to repeat that all the way through, a paper and through, all your documentation. So that can be a challenge. And one of the approaches we've used is we want to describe our sample accurately, but then sometimes in other parts of the paper, maybe let's say the results section, we've talked about participants who had their pregnancy loss and partners of those participants. So we can simplify the language in some places. We also tended to include a footnote to try and explain this evolution, sometimes in language, and also, especially when referring to prior research or the literature where they might not have asked great questions about gender, and they might use the word woman without really knowing if they were all women. So here's an example of a footnote, just trying to guide the reader through this kind of decision making. So saying things like, in our sample, couple members who were pregnant when a loss occurred included women and gender diverse individuals, whereas prior works we cite included women only. Similarly, in our sample, couple members who were not pregnant included, this whole group, but the works we cite included men only. In our literature review and reporting of our own sample, we endeavored to accurately represent the sample studied. So just trying to help the reader understand these changes potentially in language as these thoughts and ideas have evolved. So once we've determined who will be eligible for our studies, we need to develop a recruitment strategy. So here we're talking about a clear plan for identifying and reaching our prospective participants, providing them with information about the study, and enrolling them in it. So again, I'm going to show you a couple of bad examples from earlier in my research to sort of illustrate what we're talking about here. So we're thinking about considering your use of words and imagery to signal who's eligible. So here's a first example. This is a study about the sexual practices of new parents, and you can see that it features images of two people, a mother and a father, and it's likely to read as quite cisgendered and heterosexual, and probably not going to effectively reach gay, lesbian, trans, non-binary, and multi-parent families. Here's another example. So in this study, I was looking at pain during sex, and here it specifies women, right? When I was actually interested in the experience of pain during sex. And again, the imagery is signaling cisgender and heterosexual. This is so old that you can see it's when we used to have, the little tabs there too. Okay. So one key strategy for how to, approach recruitment is to have relevant community organizations circulate or support your recruitment efforts. So this involves identifying organizations that serve or advocate for your target participants and asking them to share materials. But this strategy tends to be most successful when researchers have built mutually beneficial relationships, rather than just sort of knocking on their door when it's recruitment time. So how about some strategies for how to do that then? The first one is to be thinking about your lab environment and making it more approachable to these organizations. So you want to put a face to your research project. You also want to think about your team composition. So part of collecting data from marginalized and minoritized gender sex participants is in an affirming way is ensuring that whenever possible, individuals who share those identities and those experiences are involved in all aspects of the research. So they can be as collaborators, co-authors, or in leadership positions. We also want to keep in touch. So I tend to send notes to, email updates. Here's how data collection is going. Here's, thanks. This is how many we've recruited through your support, these types of things. So it feels like you're in touch with them, not just when you need something. Another strategy is to give time to communities and organizations. So you can have team members volunteer with the organization for a certain amount of time. You can provide pro bono consultation services to community organizations, or you could offer to deliver like presentations or infographics or summaries in some way to the organization. That's the strategy I've used in our team pretty successfully, where we offer to maybe write a blog post for an influencer or contribute to an Ask Me Anything, sort of Reddit experience for their community, or different things that sort of are also trying to give back to them as well. So you want to consider, how the organization can contribute and sort of in that reciprocal way. Even when you're successful in recruiting some areas, though, based on gender and sex, you might find that your participants are still homogenous in other ways. So you need to be considering this sort of intersectionality. So these are two circumstances that we find ourselves in quite a lot in my research. One is that you effectively recruit white participants of diverse gender sexes, but struggle to recruit BIPOC participants. That happens often for us. And the second one is you effectively recruit trans and non-binary people who are assigned female at birth, but struggle to recruit trans and non-binary people assigned male at birth. So you just have to keep in mind that the conclusions from your research are only going to be applicable to the folks that you actually recruited and not to others. So it's useful and an issue of equity to try and develop recruitment strategies and pay attention to sample diversity across different axes of identity and experience, assuming and as appropriate for your research questions. Okay, so the third toolkit focuses on, the group of the sampling plan and data analysis. So who you're collecting data from to answer your questions. Here, I'm in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth for this particular toolkit, but I encourage you to have a look at it closely. Here are some of the key questions to give you a sense of what kind of content you'll find in there. So things about, is the sample representative? Does it need to be? Is it large enough to ensure statistical power? Can I ensure the anonymity and confidentiality of my participants, especially with small sample sizes? Will a convenient sample introduce bias? What happens when certain participants are underrepresented? And I'm sure that some of the statisticians in the room might be especially interested in this piece around some recommendations for aggregating, clustering, and collapsing data. I did want to make just one note about the exclusion, though, of underrepresented participants. So there are psychological costs to being excluded from recruitment and to having participated only to be excluded from analysis, right? So just like in this section on eligibility, you need to think about whether excluding small n's is warranted based on your research question. So for example, if your primary research question doesn't have to do with gender, sex, or sexualities, is there still a reason or justification to exclude a small n of those people from your subsequent analyses? A couple things to consider is if it's possible to approach your data in a slightly different way to enable sufficient numbers to include those participants. And if you do think it's justifiable, like maybe there's something in the literature that suggests that there is something different about, trans participants or non-binary participants for your research question, it's important to be transparent in disclosing why and reflect on the potential impacts that has. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the strategies for how to do that in your work. Okay, so the piece that I imagine lots of people might be especially interested in is sort of like, what are the current recommendations around how to measure gender and sexes? And there's not necessarily a single correct way that is going to be appropriate for all studies. So I can't offer prescriptive recommendations, especially because this area does continue to evolve as well. But I'm going to briefly review some of the common approaches with a little bit around strengths and weaknesses, and you can look again at the toolkit for a little bit more in-depth explanations and other resources too. There are a couple of important guiding principles to take into account here, though. So the first is that you want to be able to describe your sample with as much nuance and detail as possible. So this might mean asking about various aspects of gender and sex and separately. And this is also important because it's going to help with generalizability and for future meta-analyses, systematic reviews on the topic, et cetera. You also want to be intentional. I've sort of been talking about this a few times already. So having a strong justification for collecting the data that you are. So you don't want to ask about every piece of gender sex if you don't need to either, if it's not relevant or meaningful for your research question. You want to be precise, so to avoid proxies, right, in people's identities and experiences. If you're interested in femininity, you want to ask about femininity and not just assume questions around that because you know that people are women, for example. There are a couple harmful practices that you want to avoid. So the first is offering only binary options for the measurement of gender and or sex, like only offering the options of male and female. Using outdated or problematic language. So terms like transsexual and homosexual are both seen as offensive to communities. The language resource that I gave the link for, the BC, has a whole list of language considering, like it has a glossary of language. So if you're not sure about, a particular language, that's a great resource to check. The third is thing to avoid is that this idea that you might avoid inclusive or precise language because you're worried about confusing or offending the marginalized participants, like that they might have pushback and say, why are you asking all these different things and this kind of a thing, and making them uncomfortable. And then the fourth harmful practice is providing an other category as a response option. And this was pretty standard for many, many years. This has only shifted more recently. And this has to do with othering. This language of other in surveys tends to be a mechanism that is suggestive that some people are labeled as lesser than or less important compared to people who are explicitly named in the response options. So the recommendation now is to use wording such as something else or prefer to self-describe, typically accompanied with a write-in text box where people can put in their identity. And the last principle here is around temporality. So remember to keep in mind that people's identity can change and their gender and sex can change over time. So you want to be asking about their current identity or at a specific point in time. So if you want to know, for example, about a trans person's experiences during perinatal care, then you need to know if they identified as trans at the time when they were receiving that care. Which might be different from their identity today when they're doing your survey. So just keeping that in mind as you are thinking about your eligibility criteria and your response options. Just very briefly, gender/sex. So this sort of like combined is a concept that acknowledges that it can be difficult to disentangle the two. So human biology and sociocultural gender, they influence each other. So there can be some instances, particularly, and I'll give some examples in a minute, when you're using secondary data that has conflated the two, or you're using archival data, where it might be more accurate to just acknowledge that and say, I don't really know if this is gender or sex because of how it was measured, so I'm going to call it gender/sex. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the measurement of gender identity and gender modality. So that's the relationship between gender identity and one's sex assigned at birth. However, a lot of the same principles and guidelines can be applied to asking about those other aspects of gender that I reviewed at the start too. So just keeping that in mind. Okay, so here are two options for how to ask about gender identity. So what is your current gender identity? Response option A lists a whole host of identities, and response option B lists much fewer. So if your intention is to describe your sample, then option A has a much wider range of identities and can allow people to select what most closely resembles them. But that's a lot of response options. And the statisticians, again, are probably going, what am I going to do with that, right? So if your intention is to make comparisons, option B can be preferable, because even though there's fewer options, might be a little bit limiting to participants, it increases your chances of having, sufficient power to run analyses. It's also an option to do both, as long as you tell participants why you're doing it. So you can do something like this. When we describe the gender identity of the participants in our study, which of these categories would you like us to include you in? So this is like for your demographics and saying who your participants are. And then you can say, when we group participants for the purposes of describing and for possible comparison in research analyses, which of these groups would you like us to include you in? Please select one. So that's just about being transparent and telling participants, and again, allows you to do both. That's the approach that I've mostly adopted in recent years. In terms of gender modality, so remember, this is the relationship between a person's gender identity and the gender sex they were assigned at birth. So cisgender refers to a person who is assigned a specific gender or sex and who currently identifies with that gender sex. And transgender or trans refers to a person who is assigned a specific gender sex and who currently doesn't identify with that gender sex. So the recommendation currently is to assess separately questions about gender identity. So those are the ones I just reviewed. And then a separate question about gender modality and binary, non-binary. So not to make assumptions by just having a question about gender and just a question about sex. Can I make some assumptions around whether they're trans or not? Instead, you want to have a separate question. So it can look like this. When we describe who participated in our study, which of these categories would you like us to include you in? Include a brief definition there for folks. So a cisgender, a transgender category, neither one describes me, or I'm unsure, please specify. And then also, which of these categories would you like us to include you in? Someone who's binary, who identifies exclusively in this way, non-binary, neither of these describe me, or I'm unsure because. Okay, separate questions for each. Regarding sex, you want to be precise about what you're asking about. So defining it for the participant, like in this question. What sex were you assigned at birth? This means the sex that someone, typically a medical professional, gave you when you were born, which is often noted on your birth certificate. And you can do this either with open-ended question, let them write it in, or with check boxes, again, with the male, female, and something else or prefer not to say. Just one note here about intersex, because some of you might have included intersex previously in an option on the sex question as well. So even though we have the option for the something else there, most intersex infants are ultimately assigned a binary sex at birth. If your research question requires you to know if your sample has diversity in sex development, then the recommendation is to ask a separate question about this. So intersex researchers and activists recommend that this intersex question should be explicit and separate from gender identity and sex assignment questions. And if you need an example for that question, there is one in the toolkit. If for your research question, you need to know something about a participant's anatomy or physiology, again, you can't make that assumption based on their sex assignment. So you're going to ask it explicitly. Do you have a uterus, for example? To the best of your knowledge, are you capable of pregnancy, for example? So that's again just about the preciseness and the precision. I also want to just make a note around Two-Spirit participants. So this comes from work by Harlan Pruden, who's a Cree scholar and community organizer, and Travis Salway, who's a settler researcher, who is has one of the first North American research groups that focuses explicitly on Two-Spirit participants. And they developed a CIHR resource focused on Two-Spirit inclusion in health research. So they write, Two-spirit can and may be claimed and used by an Indigenous person as a way to opt out of and or challenge Western notions of the gender binary, man-woman. Using two-spirit in this way is a placeholder and not an identity, as there may be a non-Western, nation-specific term that is also relevant to their identity. Historically, many First Nations people had more than two genders, and currently there are around 130 nation-specific terms within many First Nation languages that name, account, and identify these other genders. So they make the following recommendation. Do not include two-spirit as an answer option if asking participants about their gender identities. So we used to do this, we don't do it anymore, okay? So it should not be one of the gender questions. Instead, embed two-spirit into questions about race and ethnicity, allowing only Indigenous participants to select whether they are two-spirit. You can provide something else or prefer to self-describe options when asking about gender identity, which allows Indigenous participants the opportunity to write in two-spirit if they choose. But when two-spirit is written in the gender questions, you have to check the associated race or ethnicity data to ensure that only Indigenous people have indicated two-spirit as their gender to be included in your data set. Where non-Indigenous people have indicated that they are two-spirit, these data should be marked as missing for most analyses. Okay, so that, again, I'm taking these recommendations from this expert group. Okay, moving along to the fifth one. So this is questions around what happens when there's change over time. So either in terms of updating measurement or methods, or because there's been shifts in participants' identities over time. So there's a number of reasons why those shifts can happen. It might be that only recently have people come to understand themselves in a particular way, so their identity has changed. They might have a long-held identity that they had to suppress for various reasons, or that they chose to conceal in the research process for various reasons, and now they don't want to anymore. So keeping in mind that these aren't static for these various reasons. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples here. So the first one with respect to quality improvement. So let's say you're a researcher, have been collecting annual data from expectant parents to 5 years postpartum since 2000. The survey has always asked, what is your gender? Male, female, prefer not to say. And what is your child's gender? Male, female, prefer not to say. Many manuscripts have since been produced regarding gender-based differences. We have this big longitudinal data set. They've conflated sex and gender in their questions for a long time and have also been writing manuscripts for a long time. So what are our options here? And you come along, you don't want to do it this way anymore. Maybe. So option one is you might decide to retain the existing question because you want to ensure compatibility in the measures across all of the survey cycles. However, this has the major drawback of continuing to mismeasure gender identity, ongoing exclusion and erasure of trans, non-binary, and other people. And it could also impact how parents are experiencing the survey and threaten the trust in the research team if they don't see themselves in these questions. Option two is you might decide to continue to ask this original question, but to also add in some bridge questions. So an additional question that is worded more in line with the contemporary approaches that I just described. You could add a short explanation for why we're asking these two, the questions phrased in two different ways, so that which promotes transparency. And it could also allow for sort of a gradual transition to the new question, because you could make some comparisons between, for example, whether you can confidently compare people who responded as females early on in the original question with people who respond to as women in the new question. The third option is to just cut ties, start fresh. So get rid of the original question, remove it from the survey, replace it with the new question. So here you'd have more accurate, inclusive, measurement of gender identity, but of course, it limits your capacity to make comparisons between the old and new surveys. The key thing here is that if you choose 2 or 3, you want to be transparent and communicate the implications in your dissemination. Okay, let's look at another example that might come up with longitudinal data. So let's say you're a researcher conducting a prospective community-based study of pregnant women living with HIV to understand their mental health needs as they become mothers. You've been conducting annual interviews with women for the last 5 years. But now one of the participants reports that they no longer identify as a woman or mother, but as a non-binary person, parent. Options here. The first option is that you could exclude this participant because you want to retain the gender identity specific criteria. So you might reason that this participant's shift in identity makes them somehow fundamentally different from the rest of the cohort. So you're going to keep the past data they've contributed, but not collect any future data from them. Two, you might decide to retain the gender criteria where new participants who are recruited must identify as women, but you might also decide that you want to retain this participant because they've included quite a lot of data so far. So in this case, you include a footnote in your future publications to indicate that one member of the cohort no longer identifies in this way. Now they identify as non-binary. And the third is that you might decide to reconsider your eligibility criteria. Maybe you decide that rather than needing participants to identify as women, you want to include all participants who are marginalized based on their gender identities. So inclusive of cis women, trans women, and non-binary people might make the most sense to you. Other thing to keep in mind is that if this participant discloses this change spontaneously to you as a researcher, there very well might be other participants in this data set that have just not come forward, but who also don't identify as women anymore. So you'll need to think about that in terms of your continued assessment as well. Okay, so how to work with secondary data and older data that maybe you've inherited from someone or archival data. I'm not going to spend, again, this is one of the ones I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the topic, but because it really comes down to two key principles. The first is transparency, which I've been talking a lot about. So we should try to examine and correct our shortcomings in the pre-existing data, potentially come up with new language to describe what we ultimately measured, which is that example I gave before about if you've conflated, if you see that there's a conflation of gender and sex, maybe you call it gender/sex because you don't really know which one exactly it is based on how the question was asked. And the second piece is accountability. So no research is perfect, and that's okay, but you can provide some detailed acknowledgements of how you recognize and have attempted to mitigate the limitations here. So the two strategies for how to do this are footnotes. So footnotes are most effective if they can acknowledge an error, briefly describe what was done. So here's an example taken from one of my own older papers. So we put a footnote that said, when we assessed this variable in 2016, we unfortunately conflated sex and gender in the question. Therefore, we refer to gender/sex as it is impossible to separate the two. We have updated our survey measures so that future analyses will be more accurate. Limitation sections are especially useful when you need more than just a few sentences to explain the shortcomings. If you're worried that it's going to get lost in a footnote and you think it's really important for understanding and how it impacted your results, some footnotes aren't allowed in the target journal as well. So that just gives you more space to describe and explain what the issue is, how it affects the interpretation of your results, and to use that opportunity also to talk about future research, what needs to happen differently. Two more to go. I know we're getting to the question time. I hope you've been writing down any questions that you have along the way. So the seventh, topic, working with validated measures. So this toolkit has, two primary goals. One is ensuring that gender and sex are accurately and precisely and inclusively mobilized when you're developing and validating new scales. So if you're someone in the audience who does measure development, there's a lot of good stuff in there about that. And the second is how to deal with existing scales. So that's the piece I'm going to talk a little bit more about. When in doubt, the ideal is to retest and revalidate a measure with a more inclusive population. Sometimes that isn't feasible, though. In that case, here are two recommendations. So the first is that you can measure twice, report twice. So essentially, you have participants do the measure twice, once with the original gendered version of a measure, and once with, let's say, a gender neutral version, and you can report the outcomes with both, reflect on any deviations. And the second is to revise the language, particularly if it doesn't change the meaning. So if changing gender language within an existing scale does not alter the underlying meaning of the measure, then you could switch to a gender neutral or an additive approach without necessarily doing further validation. So, for example, changing husband-wife to partner, gay and lesbian to a more inclusive acronym, changing pronouns to them, or changing pregnant women to pregnant women and people. It is important not to make these changes lightly, though. You have to reflect on, what the changes compromise, if anything, in terms of the validity and reliability of the measure. Is there reasons to believe that there could be, or that there are, or there aren't differences in the measured construct across genders that would suggest you need to retain gendered language in some capacity? The last one, I can't believe I am actually going to get through this in 45 minutes, talks about funding, and it also talks about ethics and publications, things like including a positionality statement, questions to ask yourself with respect to ethics and applying to the REB. But I'm just going to say a few words about funding. So in the CIHR, they have you answer 2 questions with yes or no about whether sex and gender are taken into account in your research project, and then it asks you to provide a justification here, right? So those of you who applied have seen that lots of times before. What's really important, though, for having some success in terms of this application process, and you'll know that when you receive your reviews that there's a section that reviewers have to complete about whether sex and gender was a strength or a weakness of the application. And for it to be a strength, you have to go, they have to see that you're attending to gender and sex throughout your proposal and not just in this justification section. So you have to weave it into your participant section, your objectives and hypotheses, and it has to flow from there. The analyses, the results and dissemination. If you're going to have community partners or patient partners, have you thought about, them also reflecting diversity? You also need to demonstrate that you have the relevant expertise or that you've invited a relevant expert onto your team. You might also consider having like a section within your proposal that talks about or summarizes some of these considerations. And I have, if you're interested in hearing more, a couple of examples of what that could look like just based on my own experience that I could show later. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with SPORE. So this is a CIHR funded initiative, support for patient-oriented research, and there are sort of like nodes or hubs across the country. And I'm associated with the Maritimes one, the Maritimes SPORE support unit. And in my role there around sex and gender, we've developed some resources that I wanted to share those as well with you. So I know this is too small, but over on the left here is like a flow chart as you're developing a funding application to help you think through, have I thought about this? If no, check these resources, and there's some resource lists. Have I thought about, does my proposal state if and how sex and gender or sexual orientation are going to be assessed or measured? Yes, no. And so just a little flow chart to help you think through that you've addressed this throughout the whole proposal. We also developed a few more resources about these considerations and funding, including some example like justification paragraphs that could be potentially helpful as models. Yeah, and these are just some additional questions to ask yourself when you're writing these relevant statements, and you'll have the slides. You could take a look at those. The last sort of piece that I wanted to mention is that it's becoming more common to consider inviting an expert onto a project. So the first question you want to ask yourself is like, what kind of expertise am I looking for? Am I looking for expertise in terms of education, work experience, lived experience? Like what kind of sex and gender expertise is going to be helpful and benefit the project? How are these people going to be compensated? How are they empowered to guide and advise the project? What are the power dynamics if I'm bringing someone on with this expertise? And how is the research team going to address any issues or concerns that are raised by these experts when they join the team? Okay, so just to wrap things up then, some of the key takeaway messages I hope you sort of leave here with are the importance of clear and precise communication, thinking about considering what you're trying to achieve, develop your protocol based on these goals, communicate it directly to participants. Ensuring that you're meaningfully including the prospective participants across all facets of your research, from eligibility through measurement and dissemination, and being critical, asking yourself questions all along the way. These are the resources, the links that I referred to throughout the talk. Each of the toolkits, when you access it, also has a whole bunch of additional reading and recommendations towards the end. And that, I think, has me right on time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosen, for that extremely informative and an interesting talk, and also to very precisely keeping to 12:45, which is an incredible accomplishment. So thank you. So we have lots of time now for questions and reflections and discussion. So I'd like to invite the group to put your questions in the chat, or if it's an available option to you, please unmute yourself and turn your camera on. If you have a question, you can use the hands up function as well to indicate that you'd like to be called on. All right, so
see
maybe
that I'm just going to make a note, because I think I didn't know that they would be here, but I just want to really acknowledge and congratulate AJ Loic, who's in the audience, who is the first primary author. As you could see, I'm mostly presenting your work, but I tried to include some additional examples, but it's just been so influential and useful, I think, for our research community. So, and AJ wrote in the meeting chat that Toolkit 9, Qualitative Considerations, yay, is going to be released in October, and that you're currently working on it. So, and also a toolkit about an introductory document about how to use the toolkits, which seems also very valuable. So thank you so much for the work that you've done, AJ. Have a lot of expertise as well. You can help me answer questions.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for showcasing the toolkit in such an excellent way.
Hi, Natalie. I have a question for you. Thanks for the great talk. My name is Justine Dahl, a postdoctoral fellow at IWK with Christine Chambers. I really liked your discussion around the gender neutral and gender additive kind of language. I was wondering if you could describe or talk about your experience, whether it's appropriate to use different terminology in the recruitment phase and in the reporting of manuscripts in terms of how you approach the language. I'm currently doing, in terms of context, I'm currently doing a study recruiting non-birthing parents, and I've had some fathers say that they don't identify with the term non-birthing parent. That's them. So I'm taking that more gender additive approach, but I'm wondering if it's like taking away from birthing parents, that the whole spectrum of gender and sex that I'm looking for. So I was just wondering if you could comment kind of on your experience with that.
Yeah, it's tricky. I've had that kind of feedback before sometimes with our research too. And it's also hard when you're with recruitment materials, when you're trying to be concise and just catch people's attention and not have a ton of words on there. So sorry, so you were saying the feedback you got was from fathers who didn't identify with the not yet. So that's it kind of speaks to that pushback piece that I was talking about in my talk, where the majoritized groups are what is this? I don't like this. And I have I'm just going to say my own opinion. I have really mixed feelings about that, because I think that the minoritized groups have been uncomfortable and ignored for a very long time. So if that means that some of the majoritized groups feel a little bit uncomfortable or don't really like certain language, I feel okay with that, because I think they've been comfortable for a long time and we've catered to their needs for a long time. So it's a little bit, that balance. And I think that's what you're getting, is that pushback when people are, I don't relate to this. And I think that's also where the additive language can be helpful, because it is a bit of a compromise. Sorry, I was just distracted by another chat comment. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a compromise between still acknowledging. So you could do fathers and non-birthing parents, for example, but then you run into that challenge of like how to fit everything into like recruitment materials relative to your publication that you were asking about, right? Yeah, so I think another approach you can take is to like work with community partners and get some feedback from them about some different options for those recruitment materials. Maybe you have a couple of different versions of it and you target and use different versions depending on where you're posting those recruitment sources would be another way to approach it. I think in the writing up of the manuscript itself, it's really important to accurately represent who your participants were. There's a couple of strategies like I talked about that we've been doing in our own to sort of shorten it in certain places to improve readability.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thanks. That was a great question. Maybe I can ask one if that's okay. I was wondering about, you discussed the importance of granularity and specificity, which was so important when collecting this information for describing your population accurately. How do you balance that sometimes, especially when you're working in specific populations with confidentiality or privacy, with not wanting to identify people, or sort of just wondering if you would comment or if you have anything to share or like some reflections around that.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's a really key also consideration with open science practices these days. So we run into this a lot where we want to share our de-identified databases on open science for replicability, but if we have small n's of certain people, it runs the risk of like them being able to be identifiable, maybe even like to their partner or to other people. So I think like with small sample sizes, what the approach we've been taking is that in our descriptives and how we describe our sample and the publication, we include the numbers of who they are, but then we actually don't necessarily include the gender information unless it's specific to the research question and it's needed to be there for replicability. Then we don't include the gender variable in our open science database because we're concerned that it could increase people could identify whose data is whose, especially if it can be matched to like, oh, the research was done in Nova Scotia and there were this number of people and there's age and like these other demographics. So we tend to not include that information in that area, but it's definitely, as you're getting this more precise kind of data, you have these small n's and it does increase the risk ethically of people being identifiable, which is also a consideration with qualitative research too. So with qualitative research, one of the strategies we've done is like say that, the age is plus or minus 5 years or something. Like we sort of disguise some of the data a little bit in that way. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think it's really relevant to pediatrics where we often are working with small sample sizes. So it's really helpful to hear some strategies, some creative strategies for, protecting privacy, but also sort of adhering to what we want to do in terms of open science practices.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay, well, we can wrap up here. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. If you haven't had a chance yet to complete the feedback survey, Chelsea's put the link in the chat. Please, it's very, very brief. We love to hear from you. And if you are an Impact Fellow or a CANSAT Fellow, please stay on this link for the closed discussion period. Thanks so much, everybody.